First of all, I just would like to welcome you all to the first of these Wednesday lunches. This is a particularly special one because although most of the Wednesday lunches are going to be the Center on Public Diplomacy Speaker Series, this one actually is a bridge between forging a partnership between the USC Center on Public Diplomacy and the Integrated Media Systems Center. And even more exciting, our third host of today is actually Fulbright Commission, the U.S.-Canada Fulbright Commission. So I get to introduce all those people to you as well. So if you'll bear with us, we're going to have a couple minutes of pomp and circumstance before we get to the reason that you're all here, other than lunch, which is your lunch, your intellectual lunch. As I mentioned, I'm Josh Spouts. I'm the director of USC's Center on Public Diplomacy, and I'm really excited about our speaker today, who you'll be introduced to in a couple minutes. I want to say that that the selection process for the U.S.-Canada Fulbright Chair, which was an interesting one, was highlighted for me by our speaker sending me an email saying that he had just received an email from a group of Foreign Service officers, practicing public diplomacy Foreign Service officers, who were actually using his books as sort of textbooks to help them reimagine public diplomacy. And I knew right then and there we had the right person had been selected. But my job is to introduce Michael Haas and to talk a little bit about how this came to be in 30 seconds or less. About a year and a half ago, I was invited to a breakfast with Michael Haas, who's the director of the Fulbright Commission. And this was a breakfast at the invitation of the Canadian Consulate. And I should say that the Canadian Consulate is owed a great heartfelt thanks for their generosity in calling us up when the Center on Public Diplomacy first launched, saying, this is what we do public diplomacy, we want to support what you do. We've got a great person for you to have breakfast with. And that breakfast was with Michael Haas. And Michael Haas and I talked about the creation of a Fulbright chair in public diplomacy. Some names I want to thank for, I don't even know if some of those folks are here, but I'm obliged to. Alain Dudois, who's the Consul General of Canada, who has been an incredible, who was the person who literally called us up a year and a half ago and said, public diplomacy is what I want to do, what we do, and I want to celebrate that. Eric Pelletier, who's his deputy, is a consul as well, and Pam Johnson, three people for whom we're incredibly appreciative and thankful for being able to set this up. As I mentioned, this is going to be Wednesdays, but there's also a Tuesday evening event that's going on that our speaker is hosting. That'll be 7 p.m. on Wednesday nights. And just to reiterate what I said at the beginning, what I'm most excited about this is that this is a partnership not just with the U.S., not just with Canada, not just with the Fulbright Commission in Canada, but also it's a bridge between two complementary schools at USC, the USC Center on Public Diplomacy and the Integrated Media Systems Center, which are helping to reimagine and bridge some complementary areas. So I'm going to get off the stage, pass it over to Michael Haas, the director of the Fulbright Commission in Canada.
Thank you, Josh. Well, and thank you for having me here in beautiful Southern California. I went to the Rose Cafe again yesterday morning for breakfast, and I think Pam Johnson and Eric are here somewhere, maybe hiding behind the wall or outside in the extended food line, I'm not sure. I'm a political science professor myself from Queens. I'm on loan to run the Canada-US Fulbright program. I need to give you about a 30-second commercial for the Fulbright program. As many of you may know, the Fulbright program in many ways is public diplomacy. It's been the principal instrument for public diplomacy by the U.S. government and with the university community since 1946. We sent our first Fulbrighter to China in the fall of 1946, and since then about 255,000 distinguished students and scholars have been part of the program. The Canada-US Fulbright program started in 1991, and since then we've placed more than 1,000 scholars and students in the United States. Most recently, just about 3 years ago, we started something called the Visiting Chairs Program. This year we'll have more than 50 visiting chairs across the United States and Canada, everywhere from South Florida to Georgia to Phoenix to San Diego to here in USC. In many ways, though, this was the most exciting one for me because this is indeed a marriage made in heaven. It is public diplomacy with public diplomacy. Secondly, we had an opportunity, and Josh isn't taking enough credit here. The way the process works, and admittedly the Fulbright program is process-rich. We have a 12-member academic review committee. We have a committee of university presidents, which then recommend the person. We have a committee appointed by the State Department that approves the process. Then we have a committee appointed by the President of the United States with 12 men and women, surprisingly many of them from Midland, Texas. Then we have a U.S. Congressional Committee which must sign off on every single Fulbrighter. When we first talked, Josh suggested to me some names, and at the very top of his list was Cory Doctorow. And he said, but he's a non-traditional kind of guy, so you'll have to shepherd this one through the process. My academic colleagues aren't always fully convinced that everybody who doesn't have the same credentials in their upper left-hand pocket is as good as they are. I was happy and thrilled when I discovered that everybody was excited about this prospect, from my stodgiest senior colleague on the review committee to the folks at the Foreign Scholarship Board. Nothing but clear sailing and nothing but excitement. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this. I'm thrilled to be a small part of the bridge between the Center for Public Diplomacy and the Center for Integrated Media Studies. And with that, I'll introduce Adam Powell, the director of the center. Sorry.
Thank you. We at the Integrated Media Systems Center and the USC, the Kirby School of Engineering, are delighted to be the co-hosts for Cory Doctorow for 2006-2007, as you can see on our website, for a number of reasons. Cory is not only a technology guru, it's on the internet, so it must be true. He's also, as you know, a well-known author. He has been, not in his bio, but he has been nominated for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Award twice, and just missed last time, and so his year here at USC will put him over the top next time. If we all vote, right? There are a number of ties to engineering that might not be apparent. First of all, those who write the history of new media, we still call it media, will note that Andrew Patrick in Ottawa was one of the pioneers of streaming audio and definitely of streaming video. And this is over a decade ago, when it was like the dog walking its hind legs. It wasn't great, but the fact that it could be done at all was remarkable. But why would a science fiction author be welcomed by the School of Engineering? Well, over 4 decades ago, again reaching back in history, if you walked into the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, you would have seen it was lined with books. Science fiction books. Heinlein, Arthur Clarke, Isaac Asimov. Everyone memorized Asimov's rules of robots, so it wasn't necessarily speculative fiction, it was predictive fiction. And so science fiction has a special role in inspiration. If you ask John Markoff, perhaps the most widely praised person covering technology for a daily newspaper, he says over and over again, the science fiction folks are going to be there before the rest of us. And so it's with special pleasure that we welcome Cory Doctorow, and we note that already, even though he's only been at USC a matter of days, we see that he has thoroughly endorsed all of USC's policies.
Actually, let's do one. We have one little minor administrative note, which is that because Adam has to leave at 12:45.
Okay.
To officially seal the deal, you have to sign with and have a picture taken with Cory. And I should also note.
I was told that there would be a big check.
Yeah, a giant novelty check. It's in parking structure A.
So, and we'll do the official. Let's see. I should note while we're doing this together that for those of you who haven't filled your course schedules for the fall, Cory's actually teaching a course here called which there are some flyers on the table, but it's Public Diplomacy 510, which we've subtitled Desktop Cop.
Set-top cop.
Set-top cop. Sorry. Okay, so we'll.
And you'll note these are official Fulbright pens.
And this is Eric Pelche from Canadian Consul here in Los Angeles. Welcome, Eric.
Hello.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, terrific. Shall we, woot! Congratulations.
Thanks. It's like my bar mitzvah.
Shall we close for? And he's all yours.
I wasn't at his bar mitzvah, but I hope it was better than this.
Hard to say. Hey gang, I'm Cory Doctorow, and I spent the last couple of years living in the United Kingdom. And one of the quirks of living in the UK on a visa is that whenever you touch down, you have to fill in a landing card. I imagine that somewhere, maybe in the remains of Bletchley Park or something, there's a warehouse with tens of millions of white bits of useless paper, whole forests sacrificed to some bureaucratic impetus. And the landing card is covered in little form elements that you're meant to fill out. There's a very, very small one that says occupation. And it's a uniquely 20th century and British question to ask. What do you do for a living? Because I haven't had a good answer to that question since I was about 20 years old. I'm a science fiction writer, which is an odd kind of occupation to have. Science fiction is a kind of bridge between theory and practice. You might have, as you hear in engineering, people sort of teetering on the brink of what we can comprehend. But it's sometimes necessary, I think, in engineering to teeter on the brink of what you can actually do. And it's unfortunate when engineers do that, they're accused of ethical breaches. But when science fiction writers do it, they're accused of committing literature. So an example of this, I have an old business partner who used to be in charge of webcasting Canada's music awards, the Junos. And the first year they did this, Canada's national telco, or one of the national telcos in Canada, Bell, couldn't muster the organizational wherewithal to get an ISDN line actually into the hall. Something they discovered about 5 minutes before the Junos were supposed to start. So they had their big Zing encoder there, and they had their cameras pointing at the Juno stage. And they just turned it on and left it running. It had a nice pulse and a histogram showing you what it was doing. It showed you the processor speed and how much load it was getting on. And then at the end was a network cable plugged into nothing. And all week, people came up to this guy and said how incredibly futuristic it had been to sit down and watch the Junos over the internet. Because no one wanted to admit that they lacked the technical chops to get their browser connected to his webcast. When engineers do it, they're fraudsters. When science fiction writers do it, we're authors. So science fiction tries to bridge theory and practice, not by predicting the future necessarily, but certainly by predicting the present. In 1948, we had 1984. I've just finished a novel called Little Brother about hacker kids who are mistaken for terrorists who fight the Department of Homeland Security. And those are parables about the present day, even though they might be set in the future. Indeed, the job of a science fiction writer amounts to predicting the present as thoroughly and as rigorously as he or she possibly can. And it's something that I've done, I think, in my own work. I looked at Napster and saw that we had something that had previously been thought of as scarce and precious that had become non-scarce and free. And we had an impetus that we traditionally thought of as monetary that had been replaced by something non-monetary, something reputational. And I wrote a novel called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom about it to try and describe that phenomenon. And now whenever something comes along that involves reputation economies or non-scarce allocation of resources, someone rings me up and says, how did you predict this amazing thing? Well, I didn't, right? I wrote about something that had already happened. Sometimes that's actually even more explicit. There was a controversial presentation at a games conference a number of years ago where some people who ran an ancillary business to video games admitted that they'd been hiring Latin American labor at sub-US wages to sit in multiplayer online role-playing games and do repetitive click actions that generated in-game gold that they could then sell to Northerners and Westerners. And this was at the time considered somewhat scandalous within the gaming press, and I wrote a short story about this called Anda's Game, about the first union organizer in one of these video games. And subsequently, this has become big news. They call it gold farming. It takes place a lot with the rise of games like World of Warcraft. Gold farming is something that's square down the middle of game practice and game countermeasures. There are stories which may or may not be true, but are certainly indicative of the popular consciousness about rice farms in China, rice paddies in China not being harvested because the farmers are making more money harvesting gold in World of Warcraft. And again, whenever one of these things breaks loose, one of these stories sort of seeps out into the popular consciousness. I get a lot of phone calls from people saying, how did you predict this with such prescience. Well, I didn't. I wrote about something that had already happened. One of the trends that's going on in computers is an open question about whether computers will be agents of self-determination or agents of control. It's the question about Frankenstein or iRobot. And I wrote a story called Ownzord about what happens when your computer's firmware is the firmware for this machine here, and most of the PCs that you've used is locked so that software vendors can decide what software you can and can't run and whether it can and can't be compatible with one another. And this is a big, important self-determination question, this question about whether our computers will be designed to help their owners or to control them. And every now and again, this story breaks, and people call me up and say, "How did you predict this in Ownzord?" And I didn't. I had just gotten a briefing from Microsoft about their plans to do trusted computing and wrote a story about it. I subsequently got an email from one of the Microsoft briefers who said, "How can I rebut a short story?" Which is, of course, the purpose of being a political activist and a science fiction writer, because it's a lot harder to rebut a short story than an essay. So one of the things that I've become increasingly concerned with is the way that copy restriction systems and the laws that underpin them can be used as a system of overwhelming control and private law. Lawrence Lessig observed that code is law. If you're the secret masters of AOL and you write a piece of software that says 12 people can gather in a chat room, it's as though you were the city fathers of some town and you passed a law that said only 12 people can congregate in the public square. Well, one of the elements of copyright law as it stands today, thanks to intervention from international treaty bodies, particularly WIPO, but also from multilateral and bilateral treaties that carry WIPO treaties as part of their prerequisites, is that it's unlawful to tell people how to break copy restriction systems. Well, once you pass that law, you invite abuse. It's like Chekhov said, you put a gun on the mantle in Act 1, chances are someone's going to get shot with it by Act 3. So now you have people asserting that their printer cartridges are a form of copyrighted work, and that when you reverse engineer the copy restriction that goes into their copyrighted work, you violate the law. So suddenly refilling a toner cartridge is not just something that frustrates someone who's come up with a business model about selling razor blades and giving away the handles. It's a crime. And there was a long, protracted court case, and eventually it was struck down. But this has become an increasing trend, and with things like trusted computing, that trend is going to get deeper. One area where that's entering more thoroughly is in our own data. I've been in the midst of a switch from OS X to Ubuntu Linux for about 8 weeks now. It's a long, slow process. And the second longest thing, the longest thing was actually getting Lenovo to cough up a laptop after I paid for it. Alarmingly, this laptop came with 9 copyright notices silk-screened onto the case and an acquisition agreement 8 pages long that told me what I just agreed to by opening the box. But the second longest part of this process has been exporting my own data from my own computer, getting my photos out of Aperture, a $600 piece of software that I paid for. So these theoretical anti-piracy measures have actually turned into a mechanism to restrict competition and the free flow of information and ideas. Copyright is a technology regulation, and as such, it ceased to be a mere legal discipline. Today, you find copyright being practiced and challenged by engineers who are being asked to design systems that enforce ideas embodied in a fuzzy doctrine of law using deterministic logic. One of the lowlights of my career was watching engineers struggle with how you would embody fair use using digital rights management technology and explaining over and over and over again about the fact specificity of fair use, and that unless your software could simulate a fully impaneled on-bank body of Supreme Court justices, it probably couldn't determine whether or not a use was fair or unfair. You see computer scientists being asked to address fundamental questions about whether or not it's possible to design systems that are robust against their own owners. You see political scientists looking at hard questions about self-determination and national self-determination all around the world. On the one hand, you have developing countries, the negotiator for Costa Rica, who negotiated CAFTA on their behalf, the IP sections of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, once sat me down and had me compare the differences between the autonomy afforded to Costa Rica in her agreement and the autonomy afforded to my country, Canada, and NAFTA, our counterpart, and said, this is what happens when brown people negotiate with the United States. We get the shaft. But it's also happening in wealthy nations. In wealthy nations like Sweden, you have the birth of an actual political movement who call themselves the Pirate Party. I used to work for an organization called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm still a fellow of that organization that was often characterized as radical extremists because they thought that balance was a good thing to have in copyright law and policy. The Pirate Party believes in abolishing copyright and actually sees as their mission the destruction of the entertainment industry. We have in fact created out of almost nothing except for bad feeling and the desire to self-determination an entire international movement devoted to the destruction of an industry. And there are now branches of the Pirate Party in Denmark and Norway, in France, and there's one in the United States. As near as I can tell, it's one kid on some campus with 3 members. This has become an issue in media studies as scholars ask how it's possible to create new media using new tools when the copyright law reflects only the old media and the old tools. It's generally true that copyright protects an industry and not a culture. And an industry can be defined as what happens when art meets technology. A non-industrial form of art can't be an industry, almost by definition. But the problem is that the people who have the industry today view what's being done tomorrow as merely derivative. So you have the composers in the day of Sousa saying that the talking machine would cause us to lose our voice boxes as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees. Many points to Sousa for being an early advocate of the still controversial theory of natural selection, but several million points off for missing the fact that performers weren't just trained monkeys who followed his instructions. They were, in fact, musicians in their own right. And today we have that same question being raised by media scholars who look at something like DJ Danger Mouse's Grey album, which remixes the Black album and the White album, which was fought by EMI, who controlled the rights to the Beatles. EMI didn't assert that having heard Jay-Z mixed up with the Beatles, you would be less likely to go out and buy the White album. They said that this should just be unlawful art because it displeased them, right? And when I raised this question with someone from EMI at a European presidency event in London last year, she said that the story has a happy ending because in the end we hired DJ Danger Mouse and he's producing work for us now. Well, the initial purpose of copyright in the era of the Statute of Anne was to get us away from a patronage system where art was allowed if the Pope liked it, into an industrial system where art was allowed if some people who could invest in it liked it. But this seems to have moved us straight back to patronage because there's a generation of creators and their backers who view their successors as mere derivative copyists instead of artists in their own right. So the Academy, I think, is the place to study this. It's the place where we can ask big questions about how and why knowledge goods are made. Is the impetus economic, or is the impetus cultural, or is it something else altogether? Why is it that the U.S., which doesn't have exclusive rights to databases, something that economists, who tend to treat the economy like theoretical physicists who are prone to saying things like assume a perfectly spherical cow of uniform density in addressing their problems. Economists tell us that without exclusive rights, you lose investment. But the U.S. has no exclusive rights in databases. Its database industry has grown 25-fold in the last 25 years. Europe, which has exclusive rights to databases, has had total stagnation in its database industry over 25 years, with the only growth coming from the acquisition of American companies doing business in America, right, in a nation with no database rights. So this is a place where we can start addressing some of those big questions and some of the empirical ones as well. Like, is productizing intellectual property good for a university? A colleague of mine at Reading University reported to me lately that the money that Reading University takes in from productizing the patents and copyrights that are produced by its faculty and researchers is 1/20th of the money they lay out for buying productized research from other British universities, and that this is true across the British university system. Right? What's happened is that the British university system, in its rush to productize its IP, has enriched a generation of middlemen at their own expense. Other empirical questions we can ask. Does the creation of intellectual property aid scholarship, or is a depropertized regime better for scholarship? I mean, the thing that characterizes the Enlightenment and that differentiates it from the Dark Ages that came before it is the difference between alchemy and science. Alchemists spent 500 years not telling anyone what they did and not allowing anyone to benefit or build from their research. And as a consequence, every alchemist discovered for himself that drinking mercury was a bad idea, and not much happened. When alchemists started publishing, you had the Enlightenment. Is it good to productize and to proprietize information that comes out of the academy? Or is it better and a more pure expression of the academy's interests to deproductize this stuff and turn them into common goods? How are copyright policies enforced? We hear a lot about kind of the balance that could theoretically be enshrined in our copyright policies. We have the 4 factors as set out in the copyright in fair use and the copyright statutes here. You have the Byrne 3 steps test. You have, on a micro level, you have things like USC's own policy about file sharing, which has some pretty words about what happens if someone says that you're file sharing and you're being naughty and you assert instead that you're engaged in legitimate scholarship. After all, even the Supreme Court agreed in Grokster that Grokster had more, I beg your pardon, the Ninth Circuit Court agreed in Grokster that Grokster had more public domain legitimate works than any university library in the world. When you go to the university and you say, but I'm doing something legitimate, what happens? What's it actually look like on the ground? Aram sitting there was an expert witness in the Ninth Circuit Superior Court case, in the appeals court case, and when he was busted for file sharing on the network, his letters just fell on deaf ears. And this doesn't seem to be unique to USC or to Aram. It seems to be something that happens across many university campuses, that systems administrators are unlikely to listen to pretty words about scholarship when it's their liability on the line. Comparable questions arise all over the world about what happens when rubber meets the road, and that's something that I think we can study here. So I'm a practitioner, but I'm grateful and anxious for the chance to contribute to scholarship here, to meet with some of my colleagues, to bring some of them here to speak to you, to make some new colleagues here, and to step back from 4 or 5 years of the coalface in the United Nations and standards bodies, in other trade negotiating bodies and in expert agencies, and to speak to scholars about what's going on and to find out from them what's going on in their fields. I'm immensely grateful to the Fulbright for affording me this opportunity, and to Joshua and his colleagues at the Center for the Public Domain, and to the IMSC and to the Annenberg Center for Communications Research, who have made me so welcome here. I feel like my cup runneth over. I could do nothing but social rounds for the rest of my stay here, I think, and every day meet 10 interesting people with 10 interesting things to say, and 10 long documents that they think I should be reading. And that's more or less what I'm hoping to be doing here. So thank you all very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
So as people know, the general format of these kinds of these midday lunches is really a conversation, and I told Corey it was going to be as casual and informal as that, and asked him not to bother preparing any remarks, and you can see that he honored that. Meaning with due compliments, of course. I want to say that if I could lead out with one of the first questions, just from a totally selfish standpoint. One of the things I found, just on the point that I mentioned when I was at the beginning of the introduction, was that I found interesting was how Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom had been cited by a bunch of foreign service officers who were public diplomacy practitioners as a sort of required reading for them to reimagine the future. One of the things you get into in that is sort of the power of social capital, which I think plays strongly into how public diplomacy is actually practiced. And so my sort of statement / question gets into sort of when you were exploring sort of the social capital dynamics in that story, what were you thinking about from sort of a global perspective?
You know, I was actually mostly looking at things like free and open source software projects at the time, which seemed to have a host of non-economic or orthogonal to economic motivations. Surely there were companies that saw the production of a public good, commoditizing elements of their competitors' business model as good for their business and bad for their competitors. But also there were innumerable hackers who were contributing for ethical reasons, or for reasons to do with building up their reputation among their peers, or for reasons that had to do with showing that they could overcome hard problems. And I think that we're seeing that as generally applicable in lots of other places. Certainly I think the Academy is no stranger to people whose motivations are non-economic but rather reputational, and that's something that you see a lot in diplomatic circles as well.
Should we open it up to questions?
Could you expand on your remarks about USC's IP policy, and in particular, and you can broaden it to other universities as well, but
right.
it's more than just file sharing.
Yes, I think that. Well, there's two. I think there's at least two things that that have come to my attention about USC's policy. I haven't actually spent a lot of time looking at it yet. This has been stuff that's kind of leapt over my transom while I was trying to concentrate on other stuff. But one is a policy on file sharing that included a rather remarkable statement that the purpose of the university was to promote intellectual property, which I found shocking. I think that the purpose of the university should probably be to promote scholarship, if for no other reason than if you wanted to measure a successful intellectual property output, you'd count the number of trademarks and patents and copyrights you registered. Whereas if you wanted to count if you wanted to measure how successful you were at scholarship, you might measure things like number of papers published or citations or diplomas or good works done in the school, the contributions to global human knowledge. So that I found really remarkable. The other question, though, is what happens when the school has an aggressive policy of productizing or proprietizing the material that its students and researchers produce? Does that actually produce a net benefit to the school? Not is that ethical or unethical, but is it utilitarian or non-utilitarian to take the output of the school? For example, if the entire output of the film school remained was produced as a common good that future film students could reuse freely without wondering about questions of fair use and cut and paste back into their work, or if the entire output of the music program could be used in student films without worrying about permissions, would that be a boon to the music, a net boon or a net cost? Well, my colleague Andrew Adams at Reading says that where he comes from, that the monetary cost can actually be calculated out, and that 95% of the money that's changing hands in these is going out of Reading and towards other universities, stopping first at the banks of various intermediaries who collect a fee for providing this needless service. Really, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think about the science and life sciences end of the spectrum.
So it's not an area that's really square down what I look at, but I participated in an extraordinary project last year with the London's LSA, the RSA, the Royal Society of the Arts, along with a man named Sir John Sulston, who won the Nobel Prize for sequencing the human genome, and that was called the Adelphi Project, where practitioners, experts, and scholars from various areas to do with knowledge goods got together and drafted a set of principles that governments and other policymakers could refer to when creating knowledge goods policies to come to some determination about whether these policies would be good for or bad for their national interest. So in that, Sir John Sulston's input was that he believed that it should never be possible to proprietize life forms. So I think is that what you're asking?
In part, yes.
But that's not something I have any real expertise in. If I wrote about that, it would be purely allegorical. I have a novella that's coming out in my next short story collection that I podcasted called After the Siege. That's a kind of allegory about the siege of Leningrad, which my grandmother was a little girl in. And it's a story about a kind of non-specified Eastern European state that finds a utopia by doing what the United States did after its revolution, abandoning all international knowledge good norms and really sticky-fingeredly ripping off all the patents, trademarks, and copyrights of all the countries of the world to their own benefit, and who find themselves under siege by foreign powers. And in there's a lot of stuff about biotech, but it's really meant to be allegorical. It's meant to be allegorical about, say, the TRIPS and the multilateral and unilateral trade negotiations that sometimes impose the TRIPS. One of the things that seems to be a realpolitik of treaty negotiations is that anything optional becomes mandatory when it comes to a bilateral or multilateral trade agreement with the United States. So it may be that you don't need to adopt the webcasting provisions in the Broadcast Treaty as a as a condition of adopting the broadcast treaty, or maybe that there's a great deal of flexibility in the Berne Three Steps test when it comes to adopting IP under the TRIPS, IP policies under the TRIPS. But when you enter into CAFTA, or when you enter into the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, or the Chilean and Indian Free Trade Agreement, you often find that those things become mandatory. Yes, in the red shirt and then in the blue striped shirt.
I was just in Thailand over the summer at a conference called Asia Commons. There's folks from all over the region coming together to talk about questions of intellectual property and the trade agreements that the U.S. is negotiating with most of the Southeast Asian countries right now and whatnot. And I was really struck by talking to some Thai activists who were talking about the IP section of the U.S.-Thailand Free Trade Agreement, in which one of the provisions is that Thailand's program of providing generic antiretroviral treatment to people living with AIDS, HIV, is explicitly targeted by U.S. pharma as something that has to be eliminated and pulled out so they can sell more branded drugs to this small, more wealthy section of the population. And I guess one of the conversations we had was about the mismatch between movements and progressive people and NGOs and movements at the base in most of the developing world, and their focuses in terms of IP, in terms of the fight around patents and seeds and pharma and whatnot, and what's happening in the U.S. and EU and to some degree in other places as well, with the fight being around culture and copyright. And I guess what I'm just wondering is if you could talk a little bit about whether you see there being more possibility for a political alliance between people approaching the IP fighting from different sectors, and maybe do you think that we have a responsibility, the free culture activists and whatnot have a responsibility to start paying more attention to these life and death implications in other sectors?
I think that that's a great question. It's certainly true that there has been no central unifying idea around all these different knowledge goods fights for a long time. Jamie Boyle at the Duke Center for the Public Domain has written about the need for an ecology movement for knowledge goods. That before the coining of the term ecology, I think it seemed to a lot of people that saving whales and fighting pollution and keeping and stopping the ozone layer from being depleted and all the other elements that make up what we think of today as the ecology movement were in fact separate issues and separate questions. And Jamie's been batting this idea around for a long time, and I think it's reached its present day zenith in something called the Access to Knowledge Treaty. Back about 2 years ago next month, a group of public interest organizations at WIPO converged in Geneva from all across the spectrum. There were people who worked on telecoms policy and people who worked on Médecins Sans Frontières and Electronic Frontier Foundation and academics and scholars. And they drafted something called the Geneva Declaration that pointed out that when WIPO had been made a UN agency in the 60s or 70s, that it had been chartered on the grounds that it was going to go off and do something humanitarian with copyright and patent and trademark. That there was some acknowledgement that that the core of many humanitarian efforts is the flow of knowledge goods and the way that they're regulated. And in the intervening years, WIPO had done nothing that was visibly humanitarian or arguably humanitarian, and it called on WIPO to actually do something. And this was picked up by the delegations from some of the larger developing nations, particularly India and Brazil and Argentina and Chile, who have very brave delegations at WIPO. And they basically threatened to do what had happened in Doha and Cancun, to leave the negotiating table if there wasn't some movement on this from WIPO. So WIPO said that they would adopt a development agenda, and that from now on all treaties would be seen through a lens of development, and it would undertake specific action to promote development. And then the wrangle about what that means began. One proposal from the U.S. government is that WIPO's development could be taken care of by moving it to the Permanent Committee on IP and Development, which meets every 2 to 3 years and doesn't have a budget or a mandate, and then supplemented with a website that explained how American copyright law worked for foreign developing nations' copyright ministers. I think a much more substantive one is this Access to Knowledge Treaty that grew out of many of the people who were involved in the Geneva Declaration, and it's the first treaty ever to have been written really in public. The people who are drafting this are doing it on wikis and on mailing lists. They come from all over the world in every discipline. I've sat in rooms with Sarah Deutsch from Verizon and Nick Ashton-Hart from the International Music Managers Fund and Jamie King, who screens pirate movies in a squatted pub in London, and people from the Soros Foundation and scholars from all over the world, and Indian free software hackers and the Brazilian Culture Ministry people, all of them sitting down to figure out how a treaty on access to knowledge that unified all these different issues we work on might look. And it's really inspiring. I recommend it to you. If you Google the phrase A2K, or the acronym A2K, it'll come right up, and there's lots of good stuff there. You in the blue shirt, you had a question.
Yeah. Hi, I have a sort of related question. You spent several years at the coalface of this. So what, maybe some example or something. What are the biggest barriers you found in your struggles? And maybe what are the best tactics you're coming up with?
So there are a number of barriers, and it really depends on which element of this we're talking about. But one, I think, is that the electronics companies find themselves unable to muster the will to resist the demand that they design their machines to control their users, even though arguably this is not something that sells more kit. No one woke up this morning wishing their iTunes would do less, right? And so it's somewhat of a mystery why Apple would go ahead and make and continually tighten the ratchet on iTunes and make it more restrictive every day, every time there's a new release. In the old days, the traditional tension was best exemplified by something like the VCR fight, where Sony made the VCR, Motion Picture Studios said that it was the Boston Strangler of the American film industry, and Sony spent like $1 billion in 8 years defending it in Congress and the courts, eventually went to the Supreme Court and clarified the doctrine of fair use such that VCRs were lawful. Today what happens is they end up capitulating in backroom deals and shipping devices that are far more restrictive than the law requires of them. And the reason they do this remains somewhat of a mystery to me, although I think we can see the first inkling of it in what's happened with iTunes. Apple doesn't really care how many machines you play an iTunes on, or whether you copy an iTunes or not. That's not really their core business. What they worry about is that they've sold you a device that you're intended to replace every 18 months. And that's good news, generally speaking, because it means that you'll write them a new check every 18 months. But it's bad news because, like a mobile phone, when your contract runs out, you may not replace it with a phone from the same manufacturer. If the switching costs are low enough, you might say, give me the shiniest phone, not the newest Nokia. And so I think Apple wants to be sure that no one goes out and buys a Creative iPod or a Sony iPod in 18 months when the iPod that they're currently carrying around looks like it's been through a rock tumbler and is 5 times larger, 3 times as expensive, and 1/5 as capacious as its successor device. So in that world, what Apple gets from iTunes is a compatibility right. They can sue, as they threatened to do with Real, they can sue companies that make devices that play their proprietary music. And this locks you into Apple's business, and it increases the switching cost from merely the cost of the new device to the cost of the new device plus all the music you've ever bought for it. I'm presently, as I said, switching from an Apple to from a Mac OS box to an Ubuntu Linux box, and I'm exporting all those audiobooks I very lazily bought, thinking this will never come back to bite me in the ass. I'm too smart for this. So I just checked this morning. It's going to take 40 days of real-time playback on a dedicated machine before all those audiobooks are converted to something I can play on my Ubuntu machine. That's a pretty high switching cost. That's an almost crippling, almost fatal switching cost. Now, that explains why Apple does it, but why is Microsoft and all of Apple's competitors lining up to do it? After all, you'd think that if Apple is shipping a restricted device, that you could compete with them by shipping an unrestricted device. And the answer, I think, is that everyone else wants to compete with Apple on the same terms that Apple has. Everyone else wants to be where Apple is. Everyone else wants to have Edgar Bronfman Jr. show up at their office and say, I want to charge $1.50 for an MP3, and to send them packing saying, go ahead, withdraw your licenses from our music service. Let's see how much music you can sell once it won't play on the most popular player in the world, right? So now what you get are these consortia who get together, who try to put together deals with the entertainment industry where they say, we'll be a better partner for you than Apple. And what that translates into is a device that's worse. because by definition, something that's a better partner for the music industry, who characterize the 21st century business model as the business model in which you can funge the rights that you sell people into finer and finer salami slices. So I once heard a MPA exec say, watching a TV show in a room other than the receiver that it's being received on has value, and if it has value, you should be able to charge money for it. And this is more like a urinary tract infection than a business model. You know, it used to flow free and easily, and now it comes in these painful drips. Those business models, when you get group consortia who are trying to compete with companies like Apple, those business models come to the fore in a kind of race to the bottom to see who can make the worst device. And no better example of that is in Blu-ray versus DVD HD, where you not only have two consortia that are quite fragile and fighting each other internally and incapable of mustering a common negotiating front, but they're competing with each other to see who can make the worst device and get the best licensing terms. And so, you know, you have in Blu-ray and DVD HD two almost perfectly useless technologies. Right? Microsoft just announced that 32-bit Vista is not going to support any HD formats. Sony's just announced that their first generation of Blu-ray drives won't play Blu-ray movies, and that PlayStations will cost 25% more if you want Blu-ray playback, because the cost of adding in all the anti-tampering mechanisms that are supposed to stop you from adding value to your property costs 25% of the build cost, adds 25% to the total cost of the device. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And I think that as in any hostage situation, you can negotiate or you can shoot the hostage. And I think it remains to be seen what happens. I think that with organizations like the Pirate Party, they're actually actively just trying to kill one of the people in this Mexican standoff with pistols pointed at each other's head. And when they do that, presumably the rest of them will be able to break their deadlock and move freely. Other organizations are trying to find negotiated settlements. But one way or the other, I think that's the biggest plug that's in the chute, or in Ted Stevens' pipes, tubes. I think you had the next question, and then we'll go over there.
I'm a graduate journalism student. I was wondering, what do you see as the technological future for news media over the next 20 years or so? Decline in print and this, and obviously your website.
Well,
where do you see it going?
I think Dan Gilmore nails the central problem of print journalism for the next 25 years, which is that classified advertising is better on the internet than it is in paper. And Google has proved that out by finding this giant long tail of classified advertisers who didn't even want to advertise in the back of free weeklies or community papers, but who would buy an ad on Google. And basically, when all the classified advertisers leave, it doesn't matter how good your newspaper is. They're not in business to promote the public interest. They're in business to advertise widgets, and so they'll go. So I think that newspapers are going to have to figure out, or news gathering entities are going to have to figure out how they survive in a world where they're not necessarily advertising supported. I don't think people want to buy $10 newspapers or even $5 newspapers. And so it's kind of an open question. I think Dan Gilmore's work on this is probably the best, though. And what he's been investigating is how collections of individuals can produce coherent investigative accounts of news. Because it's clear that analysis is something that blogs can do really well, non-professional blogs can do really well. But investigation might be a little harder. We've seen, I think, the first inklings of that in some blogs where you have, for example, the guy who's sitting behind the Shuna bomber who happened to be a blogger and who went home and wrote his first-person account of it, leaving it open for anyone who wanted to do citizen journalism on it to go and have a look at that and write about it. And I think we'll probably see more of that. But I don't have any great answers for this. I think I've got a good bead on the problem, but I don't necessarily know what the solution is. Question over there, and then you in the black jacket.
Yes, I was wondering if you thought about the free and open source software movement and how maybe digital license is changing the IP debate and public diplomacy.
Yeah, so one of the things about technology is that because it comes out of the academe, it tends to look a lot like academic discourse. So knowledge sharing is more important than knowledge hoarding. If you think, you can tell that the internet was invented by engineers and by academics, because when you hit Control-R to reply to an email message, it quotes the whole message that came before it. If it had been designed by a corporation with lawyers on hand, there's no way 100% quoting of works would have come in. But what does a paper look like when you get it back from your advisor? It's everything you wrote, and then everything she wrote interspersed with it, marking up what you've done. And that's the norm of discourse on the internet. It comes straight out of the academy. And so the free software movement was like that. The free software movement was a bunch of academic programmers, notably a very driven man named Richard Stallman at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab, who reacted to the first instance in which the code that they'd all shared and improved on together in the kind of Procrustean era of the IT revolution was suddenly enclosed, and they were told that they could no longer share and improve on each other's code. And so Stallman and his gang put together a license that said that we're releasing this code, and this code comes with a condition that you can do anything with it, provided that you also allow anyone else to do anything with it, except for prohibit people from doing anything with it. It was it was like the punchline of a Star Trek episode almost, or the end of War Games. It's a thermonuclear war. Would you like to play a game? And the interesting thing about Stallman is that he articulated an ideology of free software, where he talked about fundamental freedoms. So he didn't want to focus necessarily on code. He wanted to focus on what his objective was in freeing code, and his objective was to see to it that people could understand, improve upon, and communicate their improvements on the tools that they used. And when you think about that, that's as close to a definition of self-determination in a technological era as you can imagine. Now, what came later was a more kind of utilitarian movement called open source. And open source said, well, those freedoms are very nice, but your bit of wordplay in calling this free software because it gives you liberty has confused people and scared them off because they think that it also has to be free and gratis and they'll never make any money off of it. And so they created a kind of splinter movement that focuses on the economic value of knowledge sharing and code and of producing commodity code bases. I just heard a program last week where security researchers were talking about all the new virtualization features in the new AMD processors that allow you to simulate hundreds of computers in your computer at once. But of course, if you had to install Windows on every one of those computers and buy a license for every one of them, your $500 computer would cost $50,000 in license fees. It's just not feasible to do that kind of research anymore if you have proprietary code there. And so that's what they focused on. The problem is that by focusing on the utilitarian benefits of code and not the philosophical benefits of freedom, they've kind of painted themselves into a corner. With trusted computing, which is the new Microsoft initiative shared by Intel, AMD, and the other chip vendors, to allow programs to determine what computer they're running on, make sure they're not running in an emulator, and what other programs they're talking to, make sure that they're only talking to authorized programs and not your own program. It's possible to ship open source code that you can't modify or improve upon or communicate your improvements to other people with. And so you now have people producing what they call open source digital rights management code, like Sun Microsystems with its OpenDream. OpenDream is essentially something that honors the license, the GPL, but guts its intention. And the GPL has responded by drafting a new version that guarantees those freedoms again and revisits the question of whether the code is the only thing that should be free or whether keys should also be free. And the open source movement, having become so fixated on code, is finding itself coming to a real combative stance with the free software movement. And I think that's something that bears a lot of watching in the next couple of months as that license moves towards completion.
Corey, before we go on to the next question, many of you have to go to classes, so I wanted to take a pause here to give people a chance to say thank you to Corey and to welcome you all to tell you that I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday when Stephen Sesh, Ambassador Stephen Sesh, who's our diplomat in residence and was up until a month ago the acting ambassador to Damascus, will be our guest. And for those of you who want to stay on, I'm sure Corey can continue to answer some questions, but I'd like to say thank you to you all for attending.
Sorry. Yes, sir.
No, it's fine. I guess it's going to sound like I'm asking for moral guidance, but it's not that. You've written about file sharing, not just as trying to get around paying for something, but in fact there's more availability of information when there's this sort of network of users as opposed to some corporation selling you stuff. Whether it's MP3 files or movies, it seems to me that that's going to move on into other territory, whether it's cures for diseases or medicines, where you're going to be able to download it, produce it in your house, just make whatever you want. Where do you stand, or where should we be looking in terms of individual needs versus society control?
Well, it's a good question. I think that there's also social needs there that arise out of the free sharing of what you're talking about are things like 3D meshes that can be rendered out into physical objects. And I think that there's a societal benefit that arises from that. We've already seen, again, predicting the present, we've already seen the first inklings of this. The curators of the David in Florence allowed Stanford University to take very high-resolution 3D scans of the David. Now, the purpose of curatorship, as I understand it, is to curate, is to steward works that are a collective human heritage. And that is to say, to promote them and to make them available to the widest pool of people and to see to it that everyone gets the benefit of them. But the condition that was set on Stanford when they made these 3D meshes was that they restrict their further propagation to see to it that there wouldn't be Davids all over the world. Well, it's quite ironic if you've ever been to Florence, because you can't turn around in Florence without bumping into a David. And the reason is that for centuries, the way that you become a Florentine sculptor is by copying David. So it seems like there's been a real there is a real problem on the horizon. The head of the British Phonographic Institute gave a talk last year where he addressed this point. He said, one of the things about the music industry, it's almost enough to make me feel sorry for them, is that there is now a ritual obeisance that's made by anyone else who's threatened by the free flow of information, which is, we don't want to handle this as badly as the music industry, right? There's not, filmmakers, book publishers, sheet music publishers, needlepoint publishers, they all start with, well, obviously we don't want to make the music industry's mistakes. So this guy, I think, is a little on the defensive. So he started his talk with, well, you think we've overreacted. Wait till you see what happens when 3D printers become the norm. There will be no business that relies on patents or trademarks that will sustain itself in the face of home 3D printers. And a friend of mine rang me up to say, well, that was, you don't often hear music executives talking about 3D printers. That's pretty prescient. And I said, well, yeah, but worrying about what 3D printers will do to patents and trademarks is a little like worrying about what the railroad will do to oat bag manufacturers. I mean, it is catastrophic for them, but it rather misses the point. I mean, I think that it's probably more interesting to talk about what happens when you can print superbugs at home, or AK-47s, or hot meals, than it is when you can make your own Mickey Mouse stuffed animals. That's, I think, a much more profound question. And I'm actually working on a novel right now about this called Theme Punks that was syndicated on Salon last year, the first third of it. I'm just finishing it theoretically about 4 weeks ago, but anytime now. And it'll be out from Tor next year. And it's all about kind of 3D printers and what they do to the economy. Yes, sir?
Do you have any comments about activist news hoaxes like what Andy Rickenberg did a couple of days ago impersonating a HUD spokesman?
Oh yeah, the Yes Men guys. So as a writer of something that approximates online journalism, I try to report on those as hoaxes and possibly celebrate them as hoaxes. But I try never to be a willing participant in a hoax. For a couple of reasons. One is that I feel like it just undermines your credibility. But the other is that the special power of a blog for me is that it's a place that instead of like a traditional news paper where you have a cost of production and you have to recoup that cost, and the way that you see to it that you'll recoup that cost is by imagining a theoretical, a uniform audience a spherical audience of uniform density, and writing to what you think that audience wants to read. As a blogger, I write about what I think I'm interested in the hopes that someone else out there shares my interests. And it would be bad note-taking on my part to take a hoax and report on it as truth, because it would fail to leave that fact at my disposal in its most accurate form.
But if you found it interesting, you would certainly blog it.
I would blog it, but as a hoax, yeah. I think that it's, as someone interested in architectures of control and in authentication and security, and also in international trade issues and political theater as enabled by the internet, I think that it's absolutely newsworthy to say someone managed to laser print enough credentials to show up and act like a HUD spokesman and give this incredible, outrageous talk. My guess is that pretty much everyone in the room, by the time he got 3/4 of the way through, understood that this was not a HUD spokesman. You'd have to be pretty heartbreakingly naive to mistake the content of that speech towards the end.
I think they were.
You think so? Heartbreakingly naive. Well, they also believed that the levees were strong enough, so maybe they were. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'll just kind of build on the topic of you talk about blogs versus wikis, and obviously you're a fan of blogs, but have you been tempted to not switch over, but kind of incorporate wikis?
Well, I use wikis for all kinds of stuff. I mean, my books, when they come out, I always start an errata wiki where people can just, rather than emailing me with typos, and the problem is that when you email me with a typo, I might go fix it in the manuscript so it'll be fixed the next time the book goes to print, but no one else knows it, so someone else who finds that typo will email me again and again and again, and those books stay in print for a long time. Touch wood. So what I do is I set up a wiki, and I ask people to collaboratively identify typos and leave those there. I think that wikis, or anything that involves participation, suffers from and benefits from the size of the community that accumulates around it. And I've been thinking about community online lately as kind of like uranium. A little pile of uranium might give you a nice warm glow and be safe to hang around with, but big piles of uranium require special treatment or they melt down. And there's kind of two uranium strategies. One is you can spread the uranium out so it's not a big pile anymore. And a friend of mine, the guy who started Delicious, was telling me about a mailing list that he used to run that was really flamey. Everyone was always shouting at everyone else. So he inserted a 10-minute delay. Every time a message was sent, it would be held for 10 minutes before being released. And that was enough distance between the messages to diffuse the flames. The other thing you can do is you can spend a lot of time twiddling the rods. So my friend Teresa Nielsen Hayden edits an amazing weblog called Making Light, along with her husband, who's my editor, Patrick Nielsen Hayden. And they managed to hold perfectly civilized discussions about whether abortionists should be in favor of gun control, with thousands of participants who are total strangers to them, that they keep completely civilized and on topic through a variety of techniques that all amount to rod twiddling. And she's never really codified it. I actually think that there's an opportunity for some scholarship there. The closest I've seen, there's a book that was recommended to me by someone else who runs an online community, Tom Coates, who runs Barbalith and is now at Yahoo, has a book about, it's written for English school teachers about classroom discipline called Getting the Buggers to Behave. And as far as I know, that's sort of the best kind of piece of lay advice in the field. I think there's an opportunity there for another one that studies contemporary online versions of this stuff, kind of our bodies, ourselves for forum moderators. I'll mention one of the techniques she's invented is something called disemvoweling, where she removes all the vowels from a post. So it's a way of expressing moderators' disapprobation for the post without censoring it or removing it. But the distance, the cool-off period, as you winkle out the meaning of these consonants, is enough that it's really hard to get a lot of spit in your mouth about them and write something vitriolic, because the victory condition for a troll is when everyone talks about what the troll has to say. So I don't have a lot of time to rod twiddle on a wiki, so I don't use it for big projects because I just couldn't be a good steward of it. Ward Cunningham, who invented wikis, said that they would be no good unless they had gardeners, and I just don't have the time to get the soil under my fingernails.
If there are one of the last questions, I know that I was talking to someone who wanted to attend this, and I think you've covered this, but I'll ask it as specifically as I can, being a non-expert in this field. I was talking to someone who had made a living as a musician and earning revenue from the profits of their songs and sales, and they were concerned that the message that you're saying is artists shouldn't be able to make money from their work, and yet you are an artist, and I think that you actually can and do. So what's this? Is there a solution for the music industry? If you were going to count?
Well, I don't know that there's a solution for the music industry, but but that I think is exactly the problem with this discussion. Is we start off talking about artists, and we end up talking about the music industry, right? Is there a future?
Because this person happened to come from that field.
Right, but is there a future for people who are in vaudeville halls in the era of radio? Probably not. Is there a future for music in the era of radio? Absolutely. I think that at every technological turn, we found ways of breaking down barriers to the dissemination of knowledge goods, and that's enabled a lower barrier to entry and more people who could participate, and lower costs for recouping. Right? If the barrier to entry is high, you have to recoup a lot more before you can start turning a profit. And that and that what the internet has done is it's dramatically lowered barriers of entry into the entertainment industry, in a way that we've never really foreseen. And I think Chris Anderson is starting to get at the edges of what that does with the long tail, where he talks about micro audiences and musicians who are living that way. Frankly, the music industry was not a particularly efficient way of producing music. 97% of the works in copyright, according to the Supreme Court in Eldred, are not commercially available. Alanis Morissette's agent at Future Music said that 80% of the music ever recorded isn't for sale. They tell us that 97% of the musicians with a recording deal are earning $600 a year or less off of their royalties. So these aren't great systems for producing lots and lots of music, and surely that should be the outcome we desire. Now, in the U.S. framework of copyright, I think it's pretty clear that the objective of copyright isn't to compensate musicians. It's to see to it that music is produced, with compensating musicians as a mechanism for incentivizing the production of music. And I think that what we should be measuring, and this may be where the disconnect comes from, what we should be measuring is music production, not music compensation. Music compensation is good, and as an author, I'm all in favor of it. But if someone came to me and said blogging is a failure because there are millions and millions of bloggers who earn nothing, I would say that they were wrong. Blogging is clearly a success because it's lowered the barriers of entry to culture. And so the metric I think that we need to measure when we measure the success of the music industry is how many people get to play, not how much money they make on average. But I have no opposition to them making money on average. But just like I think if you invented a bread box and you hope that you were the only bread box that people would put their bread in, that you shouldn't be able to outlaw people who make bread that fit in other boxes. I don't think that if you're an incumbent musician who thrives on a model of scarcity, that you should be able to outlaw all those musicians who come after you who thrive on a model of copying.
One more question. But if the sort of ability to make music is spread much more widely, let's say, then basically what they're doing is depending on entrenched bureaucracy. I mean, it's not the musicians, it's the whole industry that's run up around them. And in that sense, wrong-headed as it is, are they acting, to some extent, what you're suggesting is that with the vaudeville metaphor is that it's eventually they're just going to, certain forms are just going to go away.
Well, vaudeville never went away.
What?
Vaudeville never went away. We still have lots of live performance.
Yeah, it comes back and it gets revived, but it's not the same. In other words, they're kind of acting rationally by trying to protect the industry for their own. They're the ones who are making the money, and they want to keep making money.
Well, I think that's probably true. I don't think that it's that whether or not an industry succeeds it should be the question that copyright policy asks. It should be whether or not culture is created. But I think that every technology has its own fitness factor that it selects for. I think that in the era of vaudeville, charisma was the important thing, right? It didn't matter if you were if you weren't very good at your performance or at your instrument rather, provided you gave a really good performance. In the era of radio, it was virtuosity because it didn't matter how well you strutted on stage. It was how good you sounded when you came through that thin, ether. And today it may be that the thing that we select for is something like conversation, where it's about whether or not you can convince 500,000 MySpace users that you're their friend so that they'll buy your CD even though they can download your music, which in fact is happening. And at each time we've had different fitness factors that selected for different kind of artists. And at each turn, the artists have looked around at all their friends 70 years later. They turned around 70 years later and they said, well, everyone making a living is a recording artist in the era of recordings. Therefore, recording is the legitimate way to make art. But their predecessors could have turned around and said, well, everyone making a living is a live performer. No one makes a living from recordings. What business do these people have disintermediating us? And I think that it's true that the music industry is probably defending some important turf here, right? If you want to go on having these giant entities that can give $600 a year to every artist in their stable and put 80% of the music they record out of print, that you really need to stop file sharing. But I don't think that that's the industry we necessarily want to preserve, nor do I think that the music industry is incapable of morphing into something successful. But it's a question of whether or not the executives who are sitting at their desk going, it will change, but please God, not on my watch, will die or retire fast enough for their successors to move the business into something that they can succeed with. One of the speakers I'm bringing in is a guy named Ethan Kaplan, who's the CTO of Warner Music, who's a great thinker and speaker on this stuff, and is really progressive. And I think that there are a lot of junior execs at these entities. Craig Engler at Sci-Fi Channel, who green-lighted putting Battlestar Galactica on the internet when it already leaked. All of those people are there, and they're in the position to do some good. But it's a question of whether their elders retire, die, or given the authority in time to save the business. Well,
okay.
Thank you very much.